The title of my talk is What is the Use of an American Scholar in the Japanese Academy? Reflections on 4 Stages in an Evolving Research Career. ちょっと刺激的なタイトルですね。Why are you here? みたいな感じ。はい。Now, so I submitted my title to Watanabe Sensei, and then they made a nice flyer. And it's very interesting. I did not choose the picture, but there's a picture there like this. Maybe they imagine my life is very 大変。大変か、深く考えてるか、どっちだろう。Right? So it's also my situation at Kyoto University. I have some goals and I have some worries. But today, my goals for this session, and also let me tell you about my goals first, and then I'll tell you about my worries for this session. So my goal is really to give you an overview of my research, kind of constellation, all the stars in the sky of Kyoikugaku. And there's Jeremy Sensei, なんとなくその辺です。Okay? And then maybe you're more interested in this kind of kokusaika, internationalization, and super global university. We always hear it in the Kyojukai, but do we know what's going on, right? What's going on, right? So this is a good opportunity to talk about that. And then I think maybe for this collaboration kai there's a new axis jiku for collaboration. So I read about this kai, and I think it's very, very interesting, talking about trying to bridge macro and micro, and psychology, clinical studies, philosophy. But one thing that's missing maybe is domestic and foreign, kokunai to kokusai. So maybe it's the first step for that internationalization of that. And then another goal, a personal goal, is to find some sources, maybe for my project that you all know about, that you can say, oh, you should read this, Jeremy Sensei, or we should talk about this. Then it's very useful for me to build my own ideas. So. Then my worries for this session. So my biggest worry is, 言語。英語で大丈夫かな。My Japanese is good for passive input, no problem. Reading and listening is no problem. But output as Japanese is not so beautiful. I can order drinks at izakaya, I can get on the densha, I can do all of this, but it's a bit difficult in this situation for my Japanese. So, ディスカッションの時とか質問の時、日本語全然構いませんので、あと、if you don't understand, just please ask. Okay, and then I'm only going to talk about, because we have short time, just a main thread of my research. I have many pieces of my research, and in my mind they connect, but maybe not so clear to other people. So, for example, I'm not going to talk about the translation work that I do. So I've translated 2 books by a quite famous sociologist of education, Kariya Takahiko Sensei at Tokyo University, 2 of his books. And I'm not really going to talk about that very much. And the other thing that I'm not going to talk about is, unfortunately, is this jisen, or genba. I'm not going to focus on that angle. I have research that I'm working on now that addresses that angle, such as PISA and pedagogy models. And for example, USA now is borrowing Japanese lesson study. Jugyo Kenkyu, they're borrowing it. So there's many things I'm interested in, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm more going to talk about philosophy and kind of the placement of my research. And then I'm also worried with any interdisciplinary interaction like this. Maybe it's not specialized enough for you. Maybe it sounds too abstract or not so clear. Or maybe it's too specialized. It's so hard to judge when you speak to an audience, interdisciplinary audience. So I hope it's not too specialized or too. And then when I describe my research in the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk more about theory and concepts and less about my methods or my data. You can just read the papers if you're interested, but I just want to give you a broad outline of my research. And then now I'm a bit worried that I'm too informal. Watanabe sensei told me, oh, it's like just talk about your research, very informal, but this is the Kyojukai room, so I feel, pressure. So, okay. And then the other thing is that I think I'm worried that maybe our starting point about how we think about our scholarship is very different. So please feel free to critique me. I have no problem. The whole point of my talk is to say, let's have the dialogue. So I'm a bit worried, but I hope you can follow along. Okay, so what will I talk about? This is the basic plan that I'd like to talk about, is talk in 3 parts. One is a kind of jiko shokai. Of course, I'd hope you know me, but it also relates to how my research has progressed over my 10-year career so far. And during that, I'd also like to talk about super global university. So it's like my trajectory and super global, and then Jeremy Sensei is in Kyoto University. Okay, so I'll talk about the confluence of those two. And then I'll switch to discuss my research, 4 stages of it. And these stages, I'll spend just about 5 minutes talking about what I think are different stages in my research. And I'll introduce them concretely with actual studies that I've done that are in the packet. So you can see exactly what type of research I do. And I would say these 4 stages are defined like this. One is I was very interested in cross-national attraction, or the politics of education. Stage 2 was policy borrowing, or processes of policy making in an era of globalization. Then the third step, stage 3, was very much a dialogue around common themes. And the 4th step is Japan as an epistemic or ontological base. I'll explain that. And then I'd like to, in the third part of my talk about kind of a synthesis, talking about, put this together in terms of a trajectory of research, a trajectory of my own life in scholarship, and also talk just briefly about my teaching. And then I want to, in conclusion, directly answer the question. So, what is the use of an American in the Japanese Academy? Now, I had 2 ideas that I could either speak for a full hour, and then we discuss, or we break it into 3 parts and discuss. But I think after Sodan, we decided full hour straight. Okay, so I hope it's okay for you. Okay, and just to keep myself going on time here, let me write that. Okay, so self-introduction. I won't spend very long on this, but it would be impossible to understand my research without understanding where I've come from. So I was born and raised in California, the United States. And I went to a regular public high school, just a regular public high school. My father's a teacher. My mother is a teacher in Hoikuen. My father is a high school math teacher, and he became Kocho Sensei at the end of his career. So I'm from a teaching family. And after high school, I went directly to Yale University. And so that's on the East Coast, very different cultural experience, very different class experience, very much elite, American elites. And I studied history there, and I studied education. And I studied kind of Cold War history, America's presence in Asia, in East Asia. Vietnam War, these types of things. Then after I finished my studies, I wanted to see some of the world. So I signed up for a program at Yale called the Yale-China Teaching Program. And this is a very long-standing program that has sent Yale graduates to teach in China for about 100 years. So they just celebrated their 100th year anniversary. So I taught in a university in southern China, a top-level university, and I was teaching classes about comparative history, comparative culture. Of course, very low level because I was just a undergraduate, but it was a chance that's special for Yale-China. And probably the best part about that job was I had a lot of time to travel. So I traveled all around I had 2 months off in the summers and 2 months off in the winter, and I traveled all around these areas. I lived in southern China, I traveled all the way down here, across the Silk Road, down into India. And then in the summer, I took a trip to first Taiwan and then to Tokyo. And to be very honest, I didn't have much interest in Japan. I wasn't very much interested in Japan. As Americans, we think we know maybe what's going on in Japan. We're pretty confident, right? Okay. So then when I arrived in Japan, I was completely shocked. What's going on in this country, right? So I've been all around Asia, and they're doing nothing similar. At that time, I thought, this is so different than the rest of Asia. What's going on? So it was such an eye-opening experience for me. I went to Tokyo, I went to Takayama, I came to Kyoto, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka. And then when I left, I got on the boat in Shimonoseki to go across to Korea. And at that time, I decided, I have to come back to Japan. This place is so interesting. What's going on here? I have to understand especially the difference with China. So, okay. So I decided at that time my next job will be in Japan. No matter what the job is, I want to go and experience Japan. So after I left China, I decided to find a job in Japan. It's not very easy as a foreigner who doesn't speak Japanese and is not a ryugakusei. But I have English, of course, so I became an English teacher. The JET program. In the countryside, I taught in a high school in Gifu Prefecture, Gifu-ken, for 2 years. But those 2 years, of course, I was teaching, but I was learning Japanese, learning about Japan. It was like benkyoukai. It was just for myself to learn, basically. So then I decided from there to go off to graduate school. So I wanted to kind of make something of all of these experiences I had. But I didn't want to go back to the United States because I thought the United States conversation is very closed. I was quite shocked that I could graduate from Iwayuru elite university and know so little about Japan or about Asia. I was quite shocked. So I said, I don't want to go there. I'd like to go to someplace more international in outlook. So I went to the UK, and I went to Oxford University for my master's, and then continued on for my PhD. And when it came time to pick a PhD topic, I could have chosen many things, but I was lucky that at the pub one night, at the pub Rose and Crown in the north part of Oxford, I was drinking one night, and there was a Japanese man there. And I started talking to him, and we shared many drinks, and we got a little bit drunk, and we said, hey, nice to meet you, and yeah. And this man was Kariya sensei. So then next week, Kariya sensei, I didn't know. I asked a Japanese friend, and my Japanese friend said that you're very famous. And he said, yeah. How about coming to Japan so we can drink and study together? Okay. So he was very kind to help me to come back to Todai for my doctoral research. So at that time, I decided to start my PhD studies on Japanese policy reforms from 1990s forward. I will explain what I looked at later. But then I spent 2 years at Todai and finished my PhD, went back to Oxford to finish my PhD, and then I came back again as Gakushin Gaikokujin Tokubetsu Kenkyuin at Todai, and for another 2 years. Yep. And then I always thought, okay, my life in Japan is basically finished, right? It must be finished soon, because if I want to be a professor, there's no chance to be a professor in Japan. At that time, even just 5 years ago, there was no chance, 6 years ago, to be a researcher, a real researcher. You can be an English teacher, you can be these types of things, but you can't be a quote-unquote real researcher. So then I was like 6 months away from finishing at Todai, and suddenly Kyoto University has this program called Hakubi. So the Maino Socho is like saying, we have to internationalize, we have to give opportunities to young researchers. Oh, sounds great. I applied and I was lucky to get it. So I started Hakubi in 2012, and then I was sitting. I was here at Kyoto University, but I don't think we had any interaction from 2012 to maybe 2015, right? So those 3 years. Because of course, Hakubi is completely separate than the Kyokuga Kenkyuka toka, right? So it's a very strange relationship. So I thought, again, there's no chance to actually enter. No chance to enter, so I just have to, my career will be finished. After Hakubi is finished, my career in Japan will be finished. I will take a position in USA or UK. But then, suddenly, from nowhere, the most unlikely place, the most unlikely tenkai ever, Abe Shinzo. 日本を取り戻すために外国人の先生を起用しよう。びっくりしました。Okay, so now Abe started his current tenure as prime minister in 2012, 2013, and he gave a very famous speech that said, we're going to hire 1,500 professors in the Kyu Teikyo Daigaku. No way, it's impossible. From Abe, I had a hard time believing, right? So, but at this time, this world or university rankings is really growing, right? The discourse around this world university rankings is growing. Oh, Kyoto University is which number, and University of Tokyo is which number. And Abe said, we're going to put 10 universities in the top 10 of the world, okay? So, like all of you, I was like laughing, no way, okay? But right after the speech, Monkasho opened this program called Super Global Daigaku. Very great name by Monkasho. So they asked for applications in order to, and we're going to give a lot of money in order to internationalize Japanese universities. And maybe some of you know, I apologize, but maybe some of you don't know this program. But there was two types. There was a type A, top type. Those had the chance to make it into the top 10 globally. And type B, which is to create more global. So, of course, Todai, Kyodai, Keio, Waseda, these universities go to top A type universities. Mostly national universities. And 13 of them were chosen. Okay? So, there was a chance. But what about Kyoto University's super global program? Okay? So, based on, after they got the money from Monkasho, they decided they had to submit a 10-year plan how to reform Kyoto University in order to make it global. Okay? So they decided on these very ambitious reforms. And this has become the Kyoto Kyoiku Gakuin, is the center of this. And I think the two key programs here are super global courses, which means classes taught in English by foreign professors, and developing joint degree programs between universities in other countries and in Japan. Now, what is really interesting is actually Kyoto University, of all those top type A, was the most ambitious to hire foreigners. They said, we'll take 100 foreigners. That was the most of anyone. Todai is like keiyaku, a few. Keio said like Nihonjin, but they have foreign gakureki, so we take them. But Kyoto University was saying, okay, we're going to hire all of these professors. And interestingly, Kyoto University is moving ahead very quickly with this program. So here is from a publication in 2014. It shows you how many professors and which countries they're from. So the USA has 8 professors, the UK has 4 professors. Kyoto University has 8 American professors, 8 British professors, 3 Australian professors. And they said, we're going to increase the number of international faculty members to 100 and increase the number of English taught courses offered to approximately 400. The next slide, this is 2015. And you can see, in fact, it's actually growing very quickly. So Kyoto University is doing what it said it would do. On your packet, on the packet I've given you, if you're interested, I put this slide here. So you can look at that yourself. The number of courses offered in English, the types of professors that are there, and these types of plans. So I've given you many materials today, and maybe it's just, you can just take them back to your office, set them down, but maybe in 1 year or 2 years later you have an interest in Kokusaika, then you can pick it up and, I remember. Okay. So there's this confluence of my trajectory and Kyoto University opening, right? So what's really interesting here is that I've actually written quite a bit about Kokusaika because, of course, it's education policy, it's related to globalization, and in some way it's the movement of policy. Many universities worldwide are internationalizing. Why is Japan doing it? So I wrote 3 articles. First one is Japan Times. This is also in your packet. I put full text from 2013. And this one was quite critical of Abe. Abe saying, really, there's no way that we're going to have that many professors, right? So this is 2013, right? I said, nothing is moving. I don't see the jobs. That's okay. Then the next one was 2015. And this was co-authored with a professor in Kyushu University, Ed Vickers sensei. And this is a very shigeki-tekina title, right? So, 外国人教員から見た日本の大学の奇妙なグローバ化. Okay? So this is in Chuo Koron. And we were many dimensions of, are you thinking about it? Who's thinking about the deep issues involved? Like, are you going to really hire foreigners for, 10-year position? Or are you just going to do contract? How do they bring their families? Do they get extra pay? Is it fair if they get extra pay? How is this going to work? So we raised many issues about it. And I was very, very critical because I was sitting in Hakubi like side office, no contact, right? いや、国際化進んでないです。全然進んでないと思ってた。Then just 2 months after this, then okay, Jeremy Sensei, you're hired. Oh. So I was very shocked. Oh, it's really happening. It's really happening. Then suddenly, Manodo Sensei, Jeremy Sensei, Vanston Paul Sensei is sitting in the back of the Kyojukai, right? So it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, right? So then you can see I wrote another piece that was in Asahi Shimbun in 2015, November. Then, sorry, this copy is a bit bad, but you can find online. But it's dialogue with Kariya Sensei, Vickers Sensei, and myself. And my tone is completely different. My tone is saying, oh, okay, now what should we do? What should we do now? 今どうすればいいです? Like, wow. So, okay, so you can read those articles at a later time. It's just to say that this kind of confluence of my own life and this opening has happened very quickly. And then it has raised the question of what is the use of an American scholar? I mean, I think everything that has happened so far in Kokusaika is just trying to set it up in terms of policy. But now we don't know, for example, in our koza, like what's my duty, what am I expected to do? Or maybe like Inagaki Sensei or Takami Sensei are thinking like, okay, how do we use them now, in a sense, right? So I don't think this conversation has been developed very strongly. So that's one reason I wanted to just get us thinking about it and hear your opinions. So the question is, what is the use of an American scholar? Any ideas? It doesn't have to be American, obviously. What's the use of a foreign professor here, or foreign ryugakusei, or?
Well, the title itself was a little bit a shock for me because I didn't think about the use in the term as a term, because I thought that if we have a faculty member from foreign country,
Yeah.
probably I was more worried about whether we would put uncomfortable burden to them.
Okay.
Because we run the faculty meeting in Japanese
Right.
so yeah, that was my feeling.
Okay.
And now, because we have faculty members from foreign countries, I hope that we can work together to develop better ideas in order to confront this globalized world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of feeling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have similar ideas.
Oh, really?
I will talk at the end of my talk. Yes, come back to it. But yeah. Anyone else, or? I mean, we could talk about it, and we will maybe when we go to discussion. What's the use? But I think your point is very interesting. One is like, what do we mean by use, right? So the way that the policies developed for super global is like use them, utilize them, right? And we can think about it like that, or we can also think about it like, what is the value? What's the use? In English also is, what's it good for? What's the value of having a foreigner here? The second half of your answer. So, okay. So this is just a very rough sketch. I thought if we had time, we would kind of discuss back and forth some ideas. But I think I think we can kind of break it into three broad categories. I guess most answers will come. So one is, at this level, this is kind of Abe, right? Raise the scores in the international rankings. So actually, そのグローバル大学ランキングではなんか number of foreign faculty で 10% ぐらいですね。で、okay, yeah, just put them there, yeah, right, okay. So we can also use them like a 英会話学校の広告, right? Oh, we have foreigners, right? So we could also do tasks, proofreading or translation, those types of things. Then I think there's another level. So these, I would say these are kind of basic tasks. Then there would be another level, which is make it possible for foreign students to enter the faculty. Some people say this would generate income for Japanese university. That's the model in the UK. Teach courses in English, Kyoto 教育学院. And some people would like to see us change the style of teaching and learning. So, foreign professors have syllabus. And 子供中心主義だから. Right? We can change this system, right? By using the foreigners, right? Okay. And then I think there's another level to this, which is, this came out in your answer, is we can be used as a bridge to facilitate this international cooperation in inviting professors here or providing contacts to students and professors abroad, for publishing in English, for attending conferences. We ourselves can publish in English, which will raise the number of citations for Kyoto University, but also publishing the ideas, some of the ideas that are here, and publishing them out for international audience. And then I think new ideas, new perspectives based on this kind of interaction between us, or putting in new ideas into the faculty is some of the goals or values. So this is kind of how do we use them, and then what's the value is more on that end, I think. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to the second part of my talk, which is about my research. And what I'm trying to do in this part is just focus on my research. I'll talk to a little bit about the teaching later, but I want to show you through my own life the different types of research that are possible by a foreign scholar. And I think what I'm trying to show is the position, the stage 4 that I'm at now, is as close as I can come to answering what is the value of an American scholar in the Japanese Academy. Okay. So stage 1 of my research, and there's in the packet here, there's the cover page and the table of contents for my first book. So this was for my first book. It was published, I think, in 2007. And it was entitled Exploring Cross-National Attraction in Education. And the question that I was really trying to answer is this one here. Why is it that particular countries become interested in the educational systems of particular other countries at certain times? So this topic comes from two sources, as do I think all of our topics. One is personal, and one is kind of the field, how the field is structured. So my personal interest in this was that I remember when I was very young as an American that we were very much excited about Japanese education. As an American in 80 nendai, everyone was like, oh, Japanese education is the best. The best. Then I came in 2003 to teach English. And the classroom was like 動物園みたい。工業高校、田舎の工業高校で、and everyone said 学力低下。Everything's falling apart. Japanese education's no good. So I was interested in kind of images of other educational systems from the very beginning. Now, in terms of the field, one of the big themes in UK comparative education is the theme of policy borrowing or policy transfer. So there have been these books, Educational Policy Borrowing, The Global Politics of Educational Borrowing and Lending. This was in 2004. And 2012, World Yearbook of Education, Policy Borrowing and Lending in Education. Basically, the idea is that in the past, educational policies usually came from kokunai forces. But with the advent of globalization now, you're getting policies transferred from one country to the next. So in the 1980s, that was in the United States trying to catch up with Japan's education, was kind of the first wave. But now it's become very, very much professionalized. So OECD is saying, oh, this is what Singapore does. This is what Shanghai does. So you should do this, and your PISA scores will rise. So this is all about borrowing and transfer of policy. So it's a one dimension of globalization. And my supervisor at Oxford, David Phillips, is a quite well-known name in the field of UK comparative education. And he developed this kind of heuristic device called the 4 stages of policy borrowing. When I started the master's program, he handed it to me. If you want to study transfer, you want to study these types of things, dozo. So basically, I won't go into it very much, but stage 1 is kind of cross-national attraction. Why do countries become interested in other countries? Then 2, why is the decision made to borrow a policy or to take a policy from another country? 3, when it's implemented, what happens to that policy? How is it adapted? How is it changed in the context? Right? For example, I mean, there's so many examples of this in Japan, right? It's this kind of selective interpretation, selective implementation of ideas. For example, これからの active learning. Maybe it's from progressive education, 子ども中心主義, but immediately it says in groups. So it's a very different approach in a way to active learning in other places. And then what happens to these policies? Do they actually get internalized? Does anything actually change in the gemba, in the places? So it was a way to understand and kind of classify all of these different studies that have taken place over time around policy borrowing. So the purpose of my study was then to focus on this cross-national attraction stage. So it was a very simple setup. This was actually my master's thesis. And what I was trying to understand is, how did America understand or think about Japanese education over a long span of time? And how did China, over the same span of time, think about Japanese education? And why that research design was interesting was because if the times of high interest in Japanese education was different, then it very clearly showed that there were different domestic criteria for good education, and there was oscillations from time to time. Maybe that's very obvious to you, but there's a theory, which I will talk about in a moment, a theory made in America that says that everyone is converging on a single model of education. So that's world culture theory. So this was just a very modest attempt to discuss kind of the politics behind cross-national attraction. Now, one of the problems with this study was that I actually didn't focus very much on Japanese education itself. Now that sounds strange, but what I was trying to do was to understand how America understands Japanese education. So I used policy texts, scholars, and media reports from the United States to understand what kind of images, what kind of stereotypes were being kind of passed off as Japanese. And then compare those versus China. What types of things was China interested in? A very simple example would be America was not interested in vocational education, but China was very interested in that. Okay? Also, America at the time of Reagan was very interested in Japan spent so little on its GDP, spends very little of GDP money on education. So they were going to use it as an excuse for neoliberal reforms. Okay? So it was just a very simple attempt in a short master's course to understand the basic ideas. But as I said, I went on to my PhD, and I had a lucky occasion to meet Kariya sensei in a pub. And I also was interested in kind of developing further my understanding of Japan itself. Coming back to Todai gave me the chance to improve my Japanese, and also gave me the chance to interact with Kariya sensei and other scholars to understand what was really happening in Japan, not the outside images of Japan. So then my next book, and this is stage 2, was this book, which came out, this was my doctoral thesis, which is called Educational Policy Transfer in an Era of Globalization. Theory, History, and Comparison. I'm sorry, I did not put anything in the packet here. The full text is online, but I forgot to put the table of contents here. But the question that I was trying to answer was, what is the nature of educational policy transfer at this particular moment? So as I showed in the previous slide, there were a lot of historical studies about borrowing and transfer, but very few people were talking about how, for example, the Meiji period was very different than the era of OECD and PISA. So I wanted to bring that out. And I also, at the same time, wanted to extend from cross-national attraction into the decision stage of research. So I decided that I would focus on Japan as a case, because Japan has, of course, this rich tradition of constantly borrowing and adapting ideas from abroad, whether it was China before or whether it's Western modernity today. So the deeper questions is, how do we understand policy borrowing and transfer? How has Japan approached it? And then I also wanted to extend my doctoral studies more into the realm of theory. So what is the importance of empirically heavy policy transfer studies? So these studies are very empirically heavy, but so what? What's the theory? What bigger question are we looking at? And so one way to think about this is to say, okay, these Oxford models, there's transfer then and there's transfer now. So how do we kind of understand how this intercultural, inter-civilizational learning has changed over time? And so I looked at all these examples, Iwakura Mission, foreign advisors, Oyatai Gaijin, this GHQ, and then different types of things, and tried to construct a historical sketch of change over time. Now, of course, with something this broad, it can't be very empirically deep. So the focus was much more on using studies that existed and combining them, and then trying to speak into a very prominent debate in Western comparative education, which is called the world culture theory debate. World culture theory debate. Okay, so there's a group at Stanford University who argues that the world is converging around a single cultural script, single cultural model. And they're very famous scholars. Neo-institutionalism is the way that they're described in sociology. And they show, for example, that all countries of the world are currently pursuing raising enrollment rates or similar types of policies. So therefore, we can say that they have adopted the same cultural script, the Western cultural script. Of course, it started in the West, but the more it goes global, it's no longer Western. So it's very Hegelian. It's very movement towards a single model that way. Now, as you would expect, there's opposition to this theory, and most of the opposition comes in the field of comparative education, comes from a scholar by the name of Jürgen Schriever at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he writes from what he calls systems theory position. We don't really need to discuss this, but basically the point is that some of the ideas or cultural scripts from the pre-modern era have carried forward into the modern era and to the late modern era. So countries are still understanding global flows and global ideas through their own cultural scripts. It may look like we're converging on a model, on a single model, but in fact, these cultural scripts are continuing on. Okay? So I came to Japan with this theory debate in mind and this kind of conceptual model for my research in place. And I was excited to come here and learn about what was happening in Japanese education. Remember, this period was 2007 to 2011, so much was happening around that time. What was happening around that time? Well, one of the things that was happening around that time was Kyoiku Kihonho Kaisei. Okay, now one of the chapters in my thesis was looking at how Japan borrows ideas from abroad. I put this in your packet. And so what I focused on in this kind of what I call late modern period is I focused on this very interesting case of a group of top leaders from Japan going to England to learn how to normalize Japanese education. So this is Sacha Kaikaku ni manabu, Kyoiku Seijouka e no michi. And here we have Abe, and here we have Shimomura. So this took place around 2005, and this group of policymakers went to England to see how to improve Japanese education. Now you can see on the next page what type of lessons or what type of places they went to look at. Some of you may know, if you know the UK context, Cullum Institute, Ofsted, 教育水準局、政策研究センター, and a lot of the places, including a textbook publisher, Rongmang, textbook publishers. And I think the most interesting thing is that on the very last, on the right-hand side, the very bottom, on the last day, 金曜日, 10月金曜日, they met with the Kyoiku Daijin, but they didn't go at that time. They didn't meet with the existing Kyoiku Daijin. They went back to meet with Sacha no Kyoiku Daijin. Sacha Seiken no Kyoiku Daijin. Kenneth Baker. So I did a lot of interviews with Monkasho officials, some Jiminto officials who were part of this, and I read a lot of the literature around this. And this is an interesting finding of itself as an example of how Japanese policymakers look to borrow or gather ideas about policy from abroad. But if you were only to look at this without any knowledge of what was happening in Japan, of course it would be a complete misunderstanding. So behind this, of course, is all of these discussions a year or two later about reform of the fundamental law of education. So it was such a fascinating case because Abe's group was going to the UK to learn how to reform the Japanese Kyoiku Kihonho. What? What? Is this kokusai ka? Is this kokusui ka? Is this global ka? What's going on, right? So is Iwakura mission, this is so different, but somehow the way that it's enacted is similar. So to be very honest, and this is now I'm getting into the weaknesses of my doctoral thesis, is I had no idea what to make of this. How do I even explain this inside the theory debate? It completely kind of ruined my conceptual and theoretical model. So I published the doctorate, but I'm not very happy about it. Not at all. I'm not happy about this at all. And the reason I think is because I realized that I was using theory and ideas from the Western academic space and bringing them sono mama to Japan and trying to understand Japan through that lens. So I realized even a year before I finished that this project is wrong. I can't do this. So that led me to the third stage. Now the third stage emerged in the third book, which is called Reimagining Japanese Education. And the cover, which you can't see, but basically there's a back cover, black and white, of kids on Juku. And my argument was that this is our image of Japanese education then, but this is actually what Japanese education looks like now. So this was Yutori Kyoiku and these types of things, right? But our image is stuck, as outsiders, is stuck in this view. So why don't we reimagine Japanese education? But of course, so the explicit question, can we reimagine Japanese education, and how can Japanese education help us to reimagine comparative education research? The deeper questions, what other perspectives are there on globalization and education? And then why are Western views of Japanese education so outdated? Why are they so dominant around the world? So I can't actually answer the questions because I myself had no idea. I was coming to this, I knew there was a need for this, but I don't know how to do it. So the best idea I had was to just create an experiment which is open a space for dialogue to answer these questions, combining Japanese scholars and non-Japanese scholars around a common theme. So if you look on the next page, page 12 in the packet, you can see from the table of contents that what I tried to do was I tried to make sure that we had an equal representation of Japanese scholars and foreign scholars. So, for example, chapter 2, I wrote together with Kariya sensei. Then we have in chapter 3 a scholar from Denmark writing about globalization and moral education. Then in chapter 4 we have Tsuneyoshi sensei at Todai. Chapter 5, Aspinall sensei, which writes about English language education, and he's at Doshisha now. Christopher Bjork, which wrote about Yutori Kyoiku at the Chugakko level. And Aaron Miller, who was a Hakobi member, and he wrote about sports and the educational value of sports in Japan. Then we have 3 Japanese scholars. Mayumi Ishikawa, who does internationalization at Handai. Manabu Sato, of course you all know Manabu Sato. And Keita Takayama, who's Japanese but works in Australia. Kariya sensei wrote the afterword. And then I got a very famous scholar of comparative education in the UK, Robert Cowan, to write the foreword. So all through the book, there's a balance of trying to create this dialogue between both sides so that we're trying to learn from each other rather than just sonomama putting it on there. I'm afraid that maybe as Japanese scholars, you already recognize that, but I'm kind of ashamed or embarrassed to say that I didn't recognize that danger until I had already finished my PhD. So that's how little people can see what's happening in terms of theoretical or epistemic kind of dominance of the Western tradition. Okay, so that leads me to the 4th one, and this one is probably the most challenging, absolutely the most challenging. This paper is called Living on Borrowed Time, Rethinking Temporality, Self, Nihilism, and Schooling. Now, the explicit question would be, what new perspectives can be gained if we understand empiric realities through Japanese social theory? In this case, the category of time. Now, in my field, there have been a lot of attempts to understand space, rethink the notion of space because of globalization. So space over the last 2 decades has received a lot of work. Okay? And the other as well, which means how do we deal with other cultures, other ideas, those types of things. But the other side of that, what I would call time and self, have not really been discussed very much at all. I think that that's so deep, the ways that we think about time and self are so deep in the Western academy that we can't really break out of them. So the way that I conceptualize this is that space, other, self, and time, all of these deeper questions, certain answers lead to this dominant grammar, this dominant way of thinking about the social world. So a lot of these come from philosophy, and then they're passed on to sociology, and from sociology they're passed on to comparative education. Obvious example is Hegel, passed on to Marx, and then from Marx we have people like Robert Arnove or Carlos Torres in comparative education. So what I wanted to do though, because you can see I was already here in Kyoto, and I was already starting to understand that there were different ideas down here that maybe even don't exist in Tokyo or Todai, or I wasn't ready for them at Todai, I don't know. But I wanted to try an experiment which was to which was to use Japanese philosophers and Japanese social theory to try to reinterpret social reality. And the way that I did that was, and again, I said this is challenging and I would welcome critique, especially from, for example, Nishihira Sensei, who is much more of an expert than I am on these issues. But if you turn the page, so it would be page 15 on your packet, page 15 of your packet, the way I tried to do this was to think about, go deeply into the philosophical basis of social theory. So I said there's views of time, temporality in Western thought. We can look at Nietzsche's critiques and Heidegger's critiques at that time. And of course, it's from Nietzsche and from Hegel that you get almost all the social theory that exists, whether it's Foucault or Marx or anything. Now flip the page. Again, it will be page 17 on your packet. So then I decided, okay, but having spent time here in Kyoto, I said, there actually is a possibility to recreate the very foundations. So let's use Nishitani, Keiji. In Shukyo to wa Nanika, he talks a lot about time. And I hypothesize, this is my kasetsu, but I guess this will be open for major critique. But I think that Maki Yusuke at Tokyo University was probably using a lot of the ideas from Nishitani. So Nishihira Sensei is like, I'm probably completely wrong. But my point was to show that there's a continuity of an alternative way of looking at time and thinking through time that exists in Japan. And if you look on page 19, the bottom, this is a Maki Yusuke's 時間の比較社会学ということですね。From this book, he develops a perspective on time. So I challenged my field, what is it possible to think about social reality and education through an alternative philosophical and sociological lens? Now, I'm not going to go into it much, but on the next page, page 21, I use this alternative lens to reinterpret or rethink about Japanese education. So, although it seems quite strange to us, actually Japan imported this concept of time, right? Clock time and linear time was imported into Japan, and the way that it was pushed out into Japanese society was mostly through schools and factories. Now, ちょっとどういうことかっていうと、look at page 24. Page 24. And this is, I'm trying to also make this work not just theoretical, but very much empirical. So if you look at this table 1, this is the diffusion ratio of clocks in Japan. So it went very quickly from 1877 to 1907. So this means that things like schools were very central. For example, Tokeidai is the center of the school. Brands like Seiko, Casio, Citizen, these are all from that turn when Japan adopted different concepts of time. So I think Nishitani's challenge and I think Maki's challenge was not to put class differences at the center, for example, class differences at the center, or the Judeo-Christian tradition at the center of social theory, but to think about it in terms of time. So, now, I know that that's a very challenging paper, and perhaps I'm completely wrong, but I wanted to show you the fourth stage and very much the stage that I'm in right now. Okay, so let me quickly move to the last part of my talk, maybe just about another 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes. And yeah, I'll finish up soon. So let me talk to you why I would present this talk in this way and why I think it's important for this larger question of what's the use of an American in the Japanese academy. And I want to talk about trajectories and teaching. Now, as I think about my own career, I think about this movement that I have made, okay? So this is how I would plot it or to explain it to someone. So I would say here on this axis is the approach that I take, the emphasis, the approach. A very heavily empirical approach, conceptual approach, theory or epistemology, and maybe ontology. Now, along this is the view of Japan. Japan as an empirical other, just a case study. Or Japan as an epistemic or ontological other. Does that difference make sense? I think stage 1 is where I was very early. Japan is just an example that I can use. Stage 2, conceptual example. Stage 3, as I started going deeper into theory, now I'm thinking that Japan is kind of, Japanese ideas are very much challenging the very foundation of how I think about my field. And then stage 4 was actually moving completely into that space and reinterpreting all of this. Now here's another view. These stages were very much comparative education in the Anglo-American style. Stage 3, historical comparative sociology. And stage 4 were philosophy in a sense.
Welcome to philosophy.
どうもありがとう先生。So, but it's not so important that I mean, this is my trajectory, but I think that there's a larger point here about how foreign scholars, what happens to them when they come to Japan. So, in very broad terms, in this place, Japan, and here I'm trying to explain this again just in case you don't quite have it yet. Japan as a case inside the universal categories of Western academia. Japan just needs to fit itself in there. And then in this space, Japan as a place to remake the categories of Western academy. Now, the closest I could come to describing this in a very simple way is to think about a meteor. What's a meteor in Japanese? 宇宙からの、石隕石のようなカリアじゃないではないかと。それは entering the atmosphere で2つの可能性。1つはもう光ってる、わー、light, shooting star, wow. もう一つは completely break up, just disappear into nothing, right? So, now, okay, I'm not going to just because of time, I'm going to skip the next two things, but I wanted to, we can definitely talk about this in question and answer. But some of the dangers with this project, some of the dangers. So one of the dangers could be, isn't this orientalizing? But another danger could be, Once I move, isn't it occidentalizing? Okay. And I'm just going to speak about occidentalizing here. Why I think I'm not doing that is that I also highlight many of the negative dimensions. So how is this project different than Nihon Jinron style discourse? One of them is I think I highlight the negative dimensions. Japan is not a paradise. Japan is a place that has different ways of thinking about social realities and education, and we can learn from those. And I also think that I'm not just challenging, my goal is not just to challenge Western scholars, but also to challenge Japanese scholars to engage in that discourse. So if you look on the packet on page, again, I'm just kind of advertising for if you want to read any of these in more detail. Page 25, is that I was asked to contribute, I was very happy to be asked to contribute a chapter to a volume that Nihon Kyoiku Shakaigaku is producing. Their first, I think one of the first English language volume. It's called Education in Japan in a Global Age. And I submitted a chapter that asked them to rethink the educational research agenda for Japan, or for the sociology of Japan in a global era. How can we rethink the main premise of Japanese sociology of education in order to make it more interesting, relevant, or connected to the world? But what I want to point out is that I'm making a critique also of Japanese scholarship as it exists. So it's not simply that I want to be here and critique Western ideas. I also want to critique ideas that we have. And why is that important? Because I think really where I think we should be sitting as a foreign scholar is right here on this crossroads, right here. So descending down like this meteor, but then making sure that we come back in order to create this discourse across disciplines, so interdisciplinary, and across the categories that exist here and the categories that exist here. So I'm trying to sit here and develop a research program that will allow both sides to interact in that way. And this is drawn up just because, just like the time paper, I hope that out of those dialogues we can create kind of alternative views of empirical realities or conceptual realities. I'm afraid that this discussion will be stuck down here only in the realm of philosophy. I want to bring it up into a more visible place. Okay, I'm really out of time. So I'm also actually going to skip the, let me just speak 1 minute about the teaching. Because that's the research part. That's my trajectory, and that's where I think that I want to create space inside Japan, the position that I've been given inside Japan. And I think it contributes to both sides. Now, another role for us as scholars is, of course, our research, but of course, our teaching. So what I'm trying to do in my teaching as well is to also create that dialogic space. And I've put my syllabus for this year's Enshu inside the packet as well. So if you're interested. And this syllabus, if you look, for example, week 2 and week 3, it asks the students to think about Japanese education and thought in a global era. Week 3 asks them, what kind of scholar will you be? Then weeks 4 through week 6 are asking them to revisit some people who have written about these key differences in thought that exist. So one of the articles that we read is Imanishi Kinji's view of how he changed primatology. Very interesting. And then a quite funny article called Sushi Science and Hamburger Science. Week 6, okay? Now, I don't want to leave my students I want to put them in the middle, but I want to give them a chance to then think through how to build some apparatus that can allow us to actually have this discussion at a deep level. And right now, I think one of the best possibilities is this idea of axial age, originally comes from Carl Jaspers. But this is really picking up in the Western academic conversation, this axial age idea. I won't go into it very much, but it came on after World War II to try to think about how can we have a cross-civilizational dialogue in the fields of philosophy and sociology. And interestingly, it produced a huge amount of work on Japan by foreign scholars. Samuel Eisenstadt wrote Japanese Civilization. A scholar named Johan Arneson wrote Social Theory in the Japanese Experience. And another scholar in University of Berkeley wrote Imagining Japan. So thinking about the Japanese tradition through this lens of axial civilizations. And I guess the key to my teaching, and this is the key point that I'm trying to emphasize, is that this dialogue itself that occurred between axial age, Japanese ideas, foreign scholars, I want that to be the text. I want them to understand the structure of that dialogue itself, rather than a particular thinker saying he has the best idea. I want them to see some of the promises and also some of the perils if we go too far down this road of difference. So I'm trying to place them in that uncomfortable in-between space by the end of the class. Oh, and this is just saying that there's actually, I show this to my students. Have any of you heard of the Mannen Doke? So this is by the founder of Toshiba, Tanaka Hisashige. He built this clock in 1851. He built it in Kyoto. And what it shows is all the different time systems that were being used. And he matched them all onto one apparatus. So my point is, what type of intellectual structure can hold fundamentally different conceptions of social reality? And how can they be done in ways that coexist and enrich each other? I think this is what I'm trying to hope to build in that sense. Okay, and I'll finish there. But yeah, let's just maybe I just finish there. No, let me say one last slide. What is the use of an American? Shallow. Shallow use of an American is using them for global rankings, English classes, proofreading. A deep is the development of new perspectives or approaches. And then what challenges does this is a very historic moment, create for Japanese academy? This is such a historic moment, don't you think? I don't think there's ever been foreigners in the top universities. There's always like a scholar who comes for a little while, or maybe spoke to D.T. Suzuki or other people, scholars here and there, but no one has actually had the time or the interaction to do this. This is such a historic moment. So what are we going to do with it, right? So I think that there's peril. One thing that can go wrong is that simply there just becomes the next wave of erasure of differences. Which means that I worry, honestly I worry, there's no other foreign professors in here, but I worry that they are at stage 1 or stage 2 and just sonomama explain Japan. And then it's quite bad because it's internally driven, right? Now this is a Kyoto University professor saying it's like this. So it's like we have to engage them in dialogue, because I think that most of them would like to become meteor if they have the chance, but maybe they don't have the chance, like meeting Kariya sensei or meeting other scholars who can teach them new perspectives. And then the promise, of course, is that it's a chance to challenge the Western assumptions. I mean, again, like I write these types of things and people say, are they really talking about things like that in Japan? And I say, yeah, you can find texts like that in Japan. So I think that's a really promise that we can use with this moment. And so the point is that really we have to have this double transfer back and forth. So we got to sit right in the middle, or at least I do. Yeah. Okay. And final thoughts. Maybe you were most worried about this one. Of course, I will help you with proofreading. Don't worry. Don't worry. But of course, as a form of dialogue, right? Or setting up international plays is great. It's the space I want to see created, right? Looking ahead, I just think that we can do more to include China and Taiwan or a non-Western other that will absolutely enrich, or Korea, that will enrich this kind of binary dichotomy. And I would like to connect to other projects. For example, Watanabe Sensei and I, we had a really good talk, like the things in lifelong learning that she recognizes. I know how they can fit into this discussion. So it would be so wonderful if we could create that collaboration. And the other thing is, if you have students in any koza who's interested or wants to have a global jinzai no future, you're welcome to send them to my enshu. Because I want to have that my enshu as a place that people can come together around that. So I'm very happy if you send them over. I won't talk about that because we're out of time, but I would just say, Kokusaika Keikyoku is not to worry. For me, it's actually contemplation and a mutual collaboration. So 考えてるだけ。はい。ありがとうございます。はい